The summer sun blazed down on the quiet suburban street, its rays bouncing off the hoods of cars lined up at a red light. The air buzzed faintly with cicadas, a reminder of the season's heat. A woman sat behind the wheel of a worn sedan, her fingers lightly gripping the steering wheel. Her belly, swollen with the weight of new life, pressed against the seatbelt, and her eyes shifted to the rearview mirror every few seconds. She wasn't speeding or breaking any laws, but an unshakable sense of unease gnawed at her. Behind her, a patrol car loomed closer. Its headlights seemed to glare, even in the bright daylight. The officer inside leaned forward, his sunglasses reflecting the world outside in harsh, mirrored precision. He had been tailing her for the past mile, his movements deliberate and his intent unmistakable. She didn't have to look back to know his type. She had encountered officers like him before. She whispered a quiet prayer, her voice barely audible over the hum of her car's engine. She was on her way to a prenatal checkup, a routine visit that had taken weeks to schedule. Her only goal was to get there and back without incident. The piercing wail of a siren shattered the relative peace, followed by the unmistakable flash of red and blue lights in her mirror. Her stomach sank as she signaled and pulled to the side of the road, her car gently rolling to a stop. She took a deep breath, forcing herself to stay calm, and adjusted her seatbelt slightly, trying to make herself more comfortable. The officer stepped out of his car, his boots crunching against the asphalt. His posture was rigid, his movements sharp and purposeful. He approached her window, hand resting on his belt in a way that wasn't exactly subtle. "License and registration," he barked, his tone clipped and devoid of pleasantries. She nodded, her hands trembling slightly as she reached into her glove compartment. "Is there a problem, officer?" she asked, keeping her voice as steady as she could manage. "You tell me," he replied, his eyes scanning her face with a scrutiny that made her skin crawl. He leaned in closer, peering through her open window. "Where are you headed in such a rush?" "I wasn't speeding," she said quietly, handing over her documents. "I'm on my way to a doctor's appointment." His lips curled into a thin, almost mocking smile. "A doctor's appointment, huh?" He glanced at her belly, then back at her face. "We'll see about that." Without another word, he walked back to his patrol car, leaving her sitting there with her heart pounding. The seconds stretched into minutes, the oppressive heat of the day seeping into the car despite the air conditioning. She tried to steady her breathing, telling herself over and over that this was routine, that everything would be fine. When the officer returned, his demeanor had shifted. There was a sharpness in his voice now, an edge that hadn't been there before. "Step out of the vehicle," he ordered, his hand hovering near his holster. She froze, her pulse quickening. "Why?" she asked, her voice cracking despite her best efforts to stay calm. "What's going on?" "Step out." "Now," he repeated, his tone leaving no room for argument. Reluctantly, she unbuckled her seatbelt and opened the door, her movements slow and deliberate. She knew better than to make any sudden gestures. Her mind raced as she stepped out onto the scorching pavement, her hands instinctively moving to cradle her belly. The officer grabbed her arm roughly, pulling her away from the car. She winced but didn't resist, knowing that any protest could make things worse. "Am I under arrest?" she asked, trying to keep her voice level. "You're being detained," he replied curtly. "For what?" "I'll ask the questions," he snapped, his grip tightening. Her heart raced as she glanced around, hoping anyone might be watching. The street was eerily empty, save for the cars speeding by, their drivers oblivious to what was unfolding. But she wasn't entirely alone. Unbeknownst to the officer, a man stood a short distance away, partially hidden by the shade of a nearby tree. His phone was raised, its camera recording every second of the interaction. He had been walking his dog when he noticed a patrol car tailing the woman, and something about the way the scene had unfolded didn't sit right with him. As the officer pushed the woman against the side of her car, his actions growing increasingly aggressive, the man stepped closer. He kept his distance, not wanting to escalate the situation, but his resolve to capture the truth only deepened. "Sir, you need to let me go," the woman pleaded, her voice trembling. "I'm pregnant, and I have done nothing wrong." "Quiet!" the officer barked, pressing her harder against the car. "You're resisting." "I'm not resisting," she said, tears streaming down her face. "Please, you're hurting me." The bystander clenched his jaw, his fingers tightening around his phone. He didn't know the woman, but he couldn't just stand by and watch. His heart pounded as he weighed his options, knowing that stepping in could put him in danger but also knowing he couldn't let this continue unchecked. As the officer began to handcuff her, his actions careless and rough, the man finally spoke up. "Hey!" he called out, his voice steady despite the fear gnawing at his gut. "What are you doing?" The officer turned sharply, his expression a mix of surprise and annoyance. "This doesn't concern you," he snapped. "It does when you're treating someone like that," the man replied, holding up his phone. "I've been recording the whole thing." For a moment, the officer hesitated, his eyes darting between the woman and the man. His grip on her arm loosened slightly, though his expression remained defiant. "This woman was resisting," he said, his voice defensive. "Doesn't look like that to me," the man countered, taking a step closer. "And it won't look like that to anyone else when this goes public." The tension in the air was almost palpable. The officer's face turned red, his anger barely contained. He glanced around, realizing that a few more people had stopped nearby, their curious gazes fixed on the unfolding scene. Some had their phones out as well, capturing the moment from different angles. The woman, still shaking, looked at the man with a mixture of gratitude and disbelief. She had felt so alone just moments ago, but now, a small glimmer of hope flickered within her. The officer's jaw tightened as he released her arm, stepping back with a scowl. "You're free to go," he muttered begrudgingly, his tone laced with irritation. The woman didn't wait for him to change his mind. She climbed back into her car, her hands trembling as she gripped the steering wheel. Before driving away, she glanced at the man who had spoken up, silently mouthing, "Thank you." The officer stalked back to his patrol car, his movements rigid with barely suppressed anger. But the damage was done. The videos circulating among the growing crowd would ensure that this moment would not be forgotten. As the woman drove away, tears streaming down her face, she couldn't shake the feeling that this encounter would haunt her for a long time. But she also couldn't ignore the courage of a stranger who had refused to stay silent. Meanwhile, the man who had intervened uploaded his video to social media, his hands shaking slightly as he typed out a caption. He didn't know what would come of it, but he knew one thing for certain: justice needed a witness, and he had provided one. Within hours, the footage began to spread, drawing the attention of people far and wide. Conversations sparked online, ranging from outrage to calls for accountability. But amid the chaos, one question lingered: would this moment of exposure lead to real change, or would it be just another headline in a long line of injustices? And somewhere, in a place none of them could see, someone else was watching. Someone with the power to make a difference if they chose to act. As the video spread across social media, reactions began pouring in from all corners of the internet. Comments, shares, and hashtags grew at an exponential rate. People demanded answers, furious at what they had witnessed. Others asked for the identities of everyone involved, insisting the officer be held accountable and the woman's story be heard. But amidst the outrage, another narrative was quietly taking shape, one that hinted at deeper implications for what had occurred that afternoon. In a small office lit by the harsh glow of fluorescent lights, a man stared at his computer screen. He was in his late 40s, his hair graying at the temples, and his expression was one of grim focus. The title under the video was simple but powerful: "Pregnant Woman Harassed by Officer Caught on Camera." Clicking play, he leaned forward, his hands clasped tightly as he watched the footage unfold. The video was only a few minutes long, but every second weighed heavily on him. He had spent over 20 years in law enforcement before leaving the force, disillusioned by what he saw as a growing culture of unchecked power and systemic failure. Now, he worked as an independent consultant, using his knowledge to push for police reform. This video was not just another example of injustice to him, it was a moment that could become a catalyst for change. He replayed the part where the officer grabbed the woman's arm, zooming in on the badge number visible on his uniform. His instincts kicked in, piecing together details that might help identify the man. The officer's posture, tone, and actions told a story of someone who had likely acted this way before. But there was something else. Something about the way the woman had looked around, as if expecting someone to intervene, and the way the officer had hesitated when confronted by the bystander. This wasn't a random incident. There was more beneath the surface. Meanwhile, the woman sat alone in her small apartment, her hands still shaking as she recounted the day's events. The checkup had gone smoothly enough, but she couldn't shake the memory of the officer's grip on her arm or the look in his eyes. It wasn't the first time she had faced something like this, but it was the first time it had felt this personal, this deliberate. She had seen the videos online by now, knowing her face and story were becoming public. Her phone buzzed with texts and calls, many from friends and family expressing their outrage and concern. Others were from strangers who had found her number and wanted to offer support. She didn't know how to feel about it all. Part of her was grateful that people cared, but another part of her just wanted to be left alone. She had spent years trying to keep her life quiet and private, and now it felt like everything was spiraling out of her control. The bystander who had filmed the encounter was also feeling the weight of the situation. He hadn't anticipated the attention his video would receive, and it wasn't long before reporters started reaching out to him. His phone rang constantly, with news outlets wanting interviews and social media users calling him a hero. But he didn't feel like a hero. He had done what anyone should do, yet the praise made him uncomfortable. He scrolled through the comments on his video, his eyes narrowing at some of the responses. While most were supportive, others accused him of trying to escalate the situation or make something out of nothing. The accusations stung, but he refused to let them deter him. Deep down, he knew he had done the right thing. The truth was there in the footage, there was no denying what had happened. The officer, however, was a different story. In the hours following the incident, he had filed his report, framing the encounter in a way that justified his actions. In his version, the woman had been combative, her behavior suspicious. He had done what he believed was necessary to maintain order. Yet, as the video began to circulate and his superiors caught wind of it, he started to feel the walls closing in. His phone rang frequently that evening, his colleagues warning him about the potential fallout. He brushed it off at first, confident that he could explain his actions. But as the hours wore on and the calls from the media started, his confidence began to waver. He hadn't expected the situation to spiral like this, and now he found himself questioning every decision he had made that day. Still, his pride refused to let him admit fault. To him, it was just another case of the public misunderstanding what it meant to wear the badge. By the next morning, the video had reached millions. National news outlets picked up the story, and it dominated headlines. Activists and community leaders began organizing protests, demanding accountability and justice. At the same time, there were whispers of something more troubling, that the officer wasn't acting alone, and that this might be part of a larger pattern of behavior within the department. The man who had been watching the video in his office decided to dig deeper. He spent hours combing through old reports, complaints, and disciplinary records, using his connections within law enforcement to uncover what he could about the officer in question. What he found was both alarming and unsurprising, a pattern of misconduct that had been swept under the rug multiple times. This officer wasn't an anomaly, he was a symptom of a much larger problem. He compiled his findings into a detailed report, reaching out to trusted journalists and legal experts. If there was ever a chance to expose the truth and push for meaningful change, this was it. But as he prepared to share his findings, he received an anonymous tip that made his blood run cold. The tip suggested that the officer's actions that day weren't random, that the woman had been specifically targeted. While the source didn't provide many details, they hinted at connections between the officer and powerful individuals who had an interest in silencing her. It wasn't just about racial profiling or abuse of power, it was something much darker, something the man knew would take significant effort to uncover. The woman, unaware of the deeper conspiracy forming around her, tried to focus on the next steps in her life. She had a baby to prepare for and a world of uncertainty ahead of her. But the more she tried to move forward, the more the world reminded her of what had happened. Her story had taken on a life of its own, and people everywhere wanted to know who she was and how she felt. Her phone buzzed again. This time, it was a number she didn't recognize. She hesitated before answering, her voice cautious as she said hello. On the other end was a woman's voice, calm but firm. "I'm calling to help," the voice said. "You don't know me, but I believe your story is bigger than you realize." The woman's heart skipped a beat. She listened carefully as the caller explained that there were forces at play that went far beyond what had happened on that street. The voice urged her to stay cautious, to avoid speaking to the press for now, and to meet privately to discuss what was really going on. The officer, too, was beginning to feel the weight of unseen forces. He had received an unexpected call late that night, a warning from someone he didn't recognize but whose tone left no doubt about their seriousness. "You've stirred up too much attention," the voice said. "This needs to be handled, and fast. Don't make it worse for yourself." As the pieces of the story began to come together, the tension only deepened. The woman didn't know who to trust. The bystander questioned whether he had put himself in danger by stepping forward. And the officer, now caught between public scrutiny and the demands of shadowy figures, realized he was in far deeper trouble than he could have imagined. Each of them was on a path toward an inevitable collision, one that would reveal truths none of them were prepared for. But for now, the questions remained unanswered, the stakes growing higher with each passing moment. The air felt heavier as the days passed, each moment bringing new developments that only deepened the mystery and heightened the tension surrounding what had initially seemed like an isolated incident. The woman tried her best to stay calm, but the constant flood of attention made it nearly impossible. The anonymous caller had left her feeling both anxious and curious, their cryptic warnings lingering in her mind. Who could they be? What did they mean by saying the situation was bigger than she realized? She found herself checking over her shoulder more often, startled by every unexpected noise. The attention from the media was one thing, but this new layer of secrecy made her wonder if her safety was at risk. The caller had arranged for a meeting in a public place, stressing that it would be safer that way. Despite her fear, she couldn't ignore the pull of curiosity. If there was a deeper truth to uncover, she felt she had to know. At the same time, the officer was beginning to unravel under the weight of mounting pressure. The public outcry had reached a fever pitch, and the department was scrambling to manage the situation. Official statements were carefully crafted, but none of them seemed to quell the anger or deflect the growing scrutiny. He had been placed on administrative leave, but the silence in his home only amplified his paranoia. Every time his phone buzzed, his pulse quickened. He had stopped answering unknown numbers, but the messages kept coming, vague, threatening, and all too unsettling. Late one night, he sat at his kitchen table, his hands trembling as he poured himself a drink. His mind raced with fragmented thoughts. Why had the bystander been there at that exact moment? Why had the woman looked so calm despite the situation? And why were people higher up the chain now calling him, hinting at things he wasn't supposed to know? He had always thought he understood the system, but now it felt like the rules were changing, and he was just a pawn in a much larger game. The man who had been investigating the case also felt the walls closing in. His research had uncovered a troubling pattern, similar incidents involving the same officer, all swept under the rug with barely a whisper of accountability. But there was more. The anonymous tip had led him down a path he hadn't expected, one that pointed to connections between the officer and influential figures in the local government. These weren't just ordinary power plays, they were calculated moves to protect interests that thrived on fear and control. The bystander, too, began to feel the consequences of his actions. At first, it was just the usual social media chatter, but then the tone shifted. Messages turned hostile, accusing him of being a troublemaker or exaggerating what had happened. He received strange calls late at night, and once, while walking home, he noticed a car following him. It was clear someone wanted to intimidate him into silence, but he refused to back down. The truth mattered more than his fear, and he was determined to see this through. The day of the arranged meeting arrived, and the woman found herself sitting in a crowded CAF, her heart pounding in her chest. She glanced around nervously, searching for the person who had called her. She didn't have to wait long. A man in his early 50s approached her table, his demeanor calm but serious. He introduced himself quietly, offering a warm but firm handshake before sitting down. "I'm sorry for the secrecy," he began, his voice low enough that only she could hear. "But you need to know what you're up against." Over the next hour, he explained that her case was part of a larger web of corruption and abuse. The officer who had stopped her wasn't acting on his own, he was carrying out orders meant to target specific individuals. Her name had appeared on a list of people deemed problematic for reasons that were still unclear. The man believed she might have unwittingly crossed paths with someone powerful or stumbled upon something she wasn't supposed to know. Her mind reeled as she tried to process what he was saying. "Why me?" she asked, her voice trembling. "I'm just trying to live my life. I haven't done anything wrong." The man's expression softened, but his tone remained serious. "Sometimes that's all it takes," he said. "You might not know it, but you're in the middle of something much bigger than yourself. And these people will do whatever it takes to protect their secrets." Elsewhere, the officer was having a very different kind of meeting. He had been summoned to a discreet location by someone he only knew as a fixer, a person brought in to clean up messes like this. The fixer was smooth, calculating, and intimidating in a way that left no room for argument. "You've made things very complicated," the fixer said, pacing the room. "But we can still contain this if you cooperate. Stay quiet, follow instructions, and let us handle the fallout." The officer nodded, but his mind was racing. He had always thought of himself as a loyal servant of the system, but now he realized how expendable he truly was. He wanted to push back, to defend himself, but the fixer's icy stare left no room for negotiation. Back at the CAF, the woman listened as the man explained how the pieces fit together. He had evidence, documents, recordings, and testimonies that painted a damning picture of corruption and abuse. But exposing it wouldn't be easy. The people involved were powerful, and they wouldn't go down without a fight. "I can't do this alone," he said, his gaze steady. "But with your help, we might be able to shine a light on what's really happening." She hesitated, the weight of the decision pressing down on her. Getting involved meant putting herself and her unborn child at greater risk. But staying silent felt like giving in to the very forces that had tried to silence her in the first place. She took a deep breath, her resolve hardening. "What do we need to do?" As the pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place, the tension reached a boiling point. The bystander, the woman, and the investigator were all on a collision course with the truth. Meanwhile, the officer found himself increasingly trapped, torn between loyalty to the system that had protected him and fear of the fallout if everything came to light. The stakes couldn't be higher, and the lines between ally and enemy blurred with every passing moment. Each character knew they were approaching a moment of reckoning, but none of them could predict just how explosive the outcome would be. The tension was suffocating, a quiet storm brewing beneath every interaction. As the woman and the investigator began piecing together their next move, the world around them seemed to shift. It wasn't just the weight of their plan, it was the feeling that they were being watched, monitored by forces that understood the stakes far better than they did. The investigator, ever methodical, had insisted on encrypting their communications and meeting only in public spaces. But even those precautions couldn't shake the sense that the walls were closing in. The bystander, too, felt the heat intensify. He had taken a risk by coming forward with his footage, and while public support poured in, the darker underbelly of backlash reared its head. A cryptic message left in his mailbox one morning stopped him in his tracks. The note was short, written in sharp, deliberate handwriting. Some things are better left in the dark. Beneath it was a printed image of the CAF where the woman and the investigator had recently met. He hadn't told anyone about that meeting, and the realization made his blood run cold. Someone was keeping tabs on all of them. Meanwhile, the officer found himself increasingly cornered. The fixer's reassurances began to feel more like veiled threats, and his attempts to push back were met with icy smiles and vague promises that everything would be handled. But late one night, he received a message that shifted the ground beneath him. It wasn't from the fixer, nor anyone he recognized. It simply read, "Do you really know who you're protecting?" The message included an attachment, an old case file buried deep in the department's archives. As the officer scrolled through the file, a knot of unease tightened in his stomach. The documents detailed a case eerily similar to the one he now found himself embroiled in, right down to the individuals involved. But this one had ended in silence, with the key players disappearing under suspicious circumstances. It was a warning, though the sender's intent remained unclear. Was it meant to scare him into submission or to push him toward the truth? The woman, now fully committed to uncovering the truth, found herself wrestling with the weight of her decision. Each step forward seemed to uncover more layers of deceit, but also more danger. The investigator had warned her that the closer they got to the truth, the more likely it was that the people involved would retaliate. But she couldn't shake the image of her unborn child. What kind of world would she bring them into if she backed down now? Her fear was real, but so was her determination. The second twist came when the investigator uncovered a startling connection. Buried in the files he had painstakingly collected was a name that sent chills through him, a high-ranking official who had publicly denounced the incident involving the woman, calling for justice and accountability. The official had positioned themselves as an ally, a voice of reason amidst the chaos. But the investigators' findings painted a different picture. This person wasn't just complicit, they were a central figure in orchestrating the very system of corruption they pretended to oppose. It was a calculated move, using outrage as a shield to deflect suspicion. The discovery turned everything on its head. If the person leading the charge for justice was actually pulling the strings, how could they trust anyone? The investigators shared the information with the woman, his voice tight with urgency. "This changes everything," he said. "If we expose this, it won't just be about one officer or one incident. It'll shake the whole foundation." But before they could act on the revelation, something happened that escalated the stakes even further. Late one evening, as the woman prepared to leave her apartment, she noticed a car idling across the street. Its headlights were off, but the faint glow of a phone screen inside confirmed someone was watching. She called the investigator, her voice trembling. "They're here," she whispered, clutching her phone tightly. "Don't go outside," he instructed, his voice calm but firm. "Stay where you are. I'll call someone I trust to check it out." Before he could make the call, the car sped off into the night, leaving her shaken but unharmed. It was a message, one that needed no explanation. The woman knew they were running out of time. Whoever was behind this wasn't just watching, they were closing in, tightening the noose with every passing moment. The bystander, too, found himself drawn deeper into the web of conflict. He had avoided sharing his suspicions with anyone, but the threatening note and photograph of the CAF couldn't be ignored. Deciding to take matters into his own hands, he returned to the area where the woman's initial encounter had taken place, hoping to find anything he might have missed. What he discovered was chilling. Hidden in the bushes near the side of the road was a small device, a camera, expertly concealed and aimed directly at the spot where the incident had unfolded. It wasn't his camera or the woman's phone that had captured everything, it was this. The implications were staggering. Someone had anticipated the confrontation, setting up the camera in advance to record it. But why? And who? The bystander didn't know whether to feel relieved or more afraid. He took the camera, careful not to leave any trace of his presence, and hurried home to review its contents. What he found confirmed his worst fears. The footage was clear, unedited, and damning. It showed not just the confrontation but something far more sinister, another figure in the background, partially obscured but unmistakably present. Someone had been orchestrating the encounter, ensuring it unfolded exactly as it had. The bystander called the woman immediately, his voice shaky but insistent. "I found something," he said, his words tumbling over each other. "You need to see this. It changes everything." As the woman, the investigator, and the bystander began connecting the dots, they realized the depth of the conspiracy they were up against. Every new piece of evidence pointed to a calculated effort to manipulate not just the incident but the narrative surrounding it. And as the officer grappled with his own unraveling understanding of the truth, he found himself at a crossroads. The file he had received painted a clear picture of what happened to those who stepped out of line. But the weight of his conscience was becoming unbearable. For the first time, he questioned whether silence was truly the safest option. The stage was set for a confrontation that none of them could fully anticipate. Forces beyond their control were closing in, and every step forward seemed to bring new dangers. But amidst the uncertainty, one thing was clear: the truth was out there, waiting to be uncovered. And once it came to light, it would change everything. The tension had reached its breaking point. The woman, the investigator, and the bystander knew they had only one chance to reveal the truth before those orchestrating the cover-up silenced them forever. With the damning footage from the hidden camera and the evidence tying the high-ranking official to the conspiracy, they devised a plan. They wouldn't take it to a single news outlet or authority figure, they would take it directly to the public. The investigator warned them of the risks. "Once we do this, there's no going back," he said. The woman didn't hesitate. "We've already gone too far to stop now." The bystander worked through the night, editing the footage to include context and ensure it would make an undeniable impact. The video was compelling, a clear narrative of corruption and manipulation, exposing the officer, the fixer, and the shadowy figures behind them. But as they uploaded the video to multiple platforms and braced for the fallout, things took an unexpected turn. The initial response was explosive. The video went viral within hours, drawing support from all corners of the internet. People demanded accountability, and the pressure on law enforcement and the high-ranking official grew unbearable. The officer's department announced an internal investigation, and public statements began to shift from denial to damage control. But just as it seemed the tide was turning, something strange happened. The video disappeared. Platform after platform reported technical errors that caused the footage to be taken down. Social media accounts associated with the upload were suspended, citing vague policy violations. The woman, the investigator, and the bystander watched in disbelief as their hard work was erased from public view. It was a stark reminder of the power wielded by the forces they were fighting against. Undeterred, the investigator pulled out a backup plan. He contacted a trusted journalist, someone who had been quietly supporting their efforts from the sidelines. Together, they arranged for the footage and evidence to be broadcast on an independent news channel, one that prided itself on standing up to corporate and political pressure. The broadcast went live during prime time, reaching millions of viewers. The journalist spoke with passion and urgency, laying out the facts in a way that couldn't be ignored. The officer watched the broadcast from his home, his hands trembling as the weight of his actions crashed down on him. He knew it was over. No fixer or high-ranking ally could undo the damage now. But as he sat in silence, A knock at the door jolted him from his thoughts. Standing on his doorstep was a man he didn't recognize, dressed in a crisp suit and wearing an unsettlingly calm expression. "It's time we talked," the man said, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. Meanwhile, the woman began to feel a sense of relief for the first time in weeks. The truth was out, and it seemed justice might finally prevail. But just as she allowed herself to breathe, her phone buzzed with a notification. It was a message from an unknown number. "You think you've won, but this is just the beginning." Attached was a photo of her standing outside her apartment earlier that day, a chilling reminder that she was still being watched. The final twist came when the investigator pieced together a detail they had overlooked. In their rush to expose the high-ranking official, they hadn't dug deeply enough into the fixer's background. A late-night search of public records and obscure financial documents revealed a shocking connection. The fixer wasn't just a player in the conspiracy, they were the architect. Every move, every manipulation, had been part of a larger plan to destabilize the system for reasons that were still unclear. The realization hit like a freight train. Exposing the official was only the surface of a deeper, more insidious plot. And as the woman and her allies stared at the screen, their triumph began to feel hollow. They had won the battle, but the war was far from over. The fixer's influence ran deeper than they could have imagined, and the message was clear: the fight for justice was only beginning. The air felt heavy as the weight of the fixer's schemes fully dawned on the group. The victory they had fought so hard for now seemed like a small crack in a much larger, darker system. The woman sat quietly, her hands trembling as she stared at the investigator's screen, which was still illuminated with records revealing the fixer's intricate web of influence. The bystander, who had always been the optimistic one, broke the silence. "So, what do we do now? Just give up?" The investigator shook his head. "No. That's not an option. But this changes things. We've disrupted their plans, but it's clear this isn't just about one corrupt official or one bad officer. This is a system. And systems don't crumble overnight." His voice carried a mix of exhaustion and determination, a reflection of what they had all been through. The woman finally spoke, her voice quiet but firm. "We keep going. We've already shown people the truth. They've seen what's possible when we don't back down. We might not be able to fix everything, but we can stop them from hiding in the shadows." Their decision to continue the fight wasn't made lightly. The threats they had received were real, and the fixer's network was vast. But they had something more powerful than fear. They had the truth, and now they had the public on their side. The viral video might have been taken down from social media platforms, but the independent news broadcast had reached millions, and people were demanding answers. Protests erupted across the city, calling for accountability not just from the officer and the official, but from the entire system that allowed such corruption to thrive. The fixer, however, wasn't going down without a fight. In the days following the broadcast, subtle attempts were made to discredit the group. Articles appeared questioning the investigator's past, painting him as a rogue agent with a grudge. The woman was accused of exaggerating her account, with anonymous sources suggesting she had been combative during the traffic stop. The bystander was labeled a troublemaker with a history of instigating conflict. It was a coordinated smear campaign, designed to shift the narrative and undermine their credibility. But the public wasn't buying it. Too many people had seen the footage, heard the woman's voice cracking with emotion as she recounted her experience, and felt the raw injustice of what had happened. The tide had turned, and the fixer's usual tactics weren't enough to silence the growing demand for change. As the weeks went on, the investigation into the officer's conduct expanded. More victims came forward, sharing their own stories of mistreatment and abuse. Some had remained silent for years, fearing retaliation, but seeing the woman's bravery inspired them to speak out. The officer was eventually suspended, and charges were filed against him for multiple violations of civil rights. It wasn't the complete justice the woman had hoped for, but it was a step in the right direction. The high-ranking official wasn't as lucky. The evidence tying him to the cover-up was irrefutable, and the pressure from the public and media forced his resignation. He was later indicted on charges of obstruction of justice and conspiracy, marking a significant victory in the group's fight against corruption. Despite these wins, the fixer remained elusive. Every lead the investigator pursued seemed to end in a dead end, as if the fixer had anticipated their moves and erased their tracks in advance. Frustration mounted, but the group refused to let it deter them. They shifted their focus to empowering others, sharing their story with communities across the city and encouraging people to stand up against injustice. One night, as they sat together reviewing their progress, the investigator received a call from an unexpected source, the journalist who had helped broadcast their story. "I've been digging into the fixer's connections," the journalist said, his voice tense with urgency. "I think I've found something you'll want to see." The group met with the journalist the next day, and what he revealed left them stunned. The fixer wasn't just a shadowy figure pulling strings behind the scenes, they were deeply embedded in the city's political and corporate infrastructure. The journalist showed them documents linking the fixer to multiple high-profile projects, each marked by the same pattern of corruption and exploitation. It was clear that taking down the fixer would require more than just evidence, it would require exposing the entire system they had built around themselves. The woman felt a mix of anger and resolve as she looked over the files. "This is bigger than I thought," she admitted. "But it just proves why we can't stop now." The group decided to release the new information carefully, partnering with trusted journalists and activists to ensure it couldn't be buried or discredited. They worked tirelessly, knowing the risks but believing in the importance of what they were doing. Slowly but surely, the cracks in the fixer's empire began to widen. Allies they had relied on started distancing themselves, fearing the fallout from being associated with someone so publicly exposed. The fixer, once untouchable, was now on the defensive. Their influence waned as public outrage grew, and even those who had once benefited from their schemes turned against them. In the end, it wasn't a single dramatic confrontation that brought the fixer down, it was the relentless pressure of ordinary people refusing to stay silent. The fixer was arrested on charges of fraud, bribery, and conspiracy, their carefully constructed empire reduced to rubble. For the woman, the bystander, and the investigator, the victory was bittersweet. They knew there was still much work to be done, but they also knew they had achieved something remarkable. They had shown that even the most powerful forces could be held accountable when people came together and refused to back down. As the dust settled, the woman reflected on how far they had come. She thought about the fear and anger she had felt that night, sitting in her car as the officer's rage bore down on her. She thought about the countless others who had suffered in silence, and the strength it had taken to stand up and say, "Enough." Most of all, she thought about the power of truth, how it could cut through lies and deceit, shining a light on even the darkest corners. In the end, the group parted ways, each of them continuing to fight for justice in their own way. The woman became an advocate for victims of police misconduct, using her voice to bring attention to their stories. The bystander dedicated themselves to grassroots organizing, helping communities hold those in power accountable. The investigator continued his work, more determined than ever to uncover the truth, no matter how deeply it was buried. Their story became a symbol of hope and resilience, a reminder that even in the face of overwhelming odds, change was possible. And though the fight was far from over, they knew they had made a difference. For them, that was enough.